My name is Keiko Tanaka. I am 78 years old, and on February 14, 1948, I died for exactly 23 minutes in an American prisoner of war camp. What happened next changed everything I believed about life, death, and the God I thought I didn't know. I was born in Hiroshima in 1925, the daughter of a proud samurai family. My father served as a government official, and my mother dedicated her life to maintaining our traditional household. From my earliest memories, our home was filled with the scent of incense burning before our family shrine, where we honored our ancestors every morning and evening. The spirits of our forebears watched over us, or so I believed, guiding our steps and blessing our endeavors. My childhood was shaped by the ancient ways. I learned to bow properly, to serve tea with reverence, and to understand that my highest purpose was to bring honor to my family name. The emperor was divine, a living God whose word was absolute truth. When I knelt before his portrait in our family altar, I felt the weight of generations pressing down on my shoulders. My grandmother would tell me stories of our samurai ancestors who died with honor rather than face the shame of defeat. Death before dishonor was not just a saying in our household, it was a sacred promise. The Shinto shrines were my sanctuary. I would walk the stone paths between the towering torii gates, feeling connected to something larger than myself. The kami spirits dwelled in every tree, every rock, every flowing stream. Buddhism taught me about the cycle of rebirth, about karma, about finding peace through meditation and right living. Christianity was foreign, Western, something that threatened our pure Japanese spirit. Missionaries were viewed with suspicion, their message of a crucified God seeming weak compared to our warrior traditions. When the war came, everything I believed was put to the ultimate test. I was 18 when I volunteered to serve as a translator and nurse for the Japanese military. The propaganda filled our hearts with righteous fire. Americans were demons who wanted to destroy our sacred homeland, to defile our emperor and enslave our people. We were told that they were monsters who showed no mercy, who tortured prisoners and defiled our women. Every day brought new stories of American brutality, and my hatred grew like a living thing inside my chest. Ask yourself this question: have you ever believed so deeply in something that you were willing to die for it? That belief consumed every breath I took. I worked in military hospitals, tending to wounded soldiers who spoke of American cruelty with their dying breaths. I translated captured documents, each page confirming what we already knew about our enemy's evil nature. When American bombers flew overhead, I shook my fist at the sky and prayed to all the gods that they would be struck down. The day they dropped the atomic bomb on my city, I was stationed 300 kilometers away. When the news reached us, something broke inside my soul. My childhood home, the shrine where I had prayed, the graves of my ancestors, all turned to ash in an instant. The Americans had not just killed people, they had murdered the spirits themselves. My hatred became a burning coal in my chest that no amount of prayer could cool. But then came the surrender, and with it, the greatest shame imaginable. Our divine emperor spoke on the radio, telling us to lay down our arms. I listened to his voice crackling through the static and felt my world collapse. Everything I had believed, every sacrifice I had made, every prayer I had offered, all of it had been for nothing. We were defeated, and defeat meant we had failed our ancestors, our emperor, and ourselves. The American soldiers came for us 3 days later. I had expected them to kill us immediately, but instead they loaded us into trucks like cattle. My fellow nurses and I were transported to a prisoner of war camp in the mountains, far from anything that resembled home. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, and every morning we woke to the sound of American voices barking orders we barely understood. The camps were designed to break our spirits, and they succeeded beyond anything our captors could have imagined. We slept on thin mats in overcrowded barracks, the walls too thin to keep out the mountain cold. Food was scarce, usually consisting of watery soup and stale bread that left us constantly hungry. But the physical hardships were nothing compared to the spiritual devastation. Every day brought fresh humiliation. We were forced to participate in what they called re-education programs, listening to lectures about democracy and freedom while our stomachs cramped with hunger. They showed us films of the atomic bomb damage, claiming it was necessary to end the war quickly. When I saw the ruins of Hiroshima on that grainy screen, I wept not just for the dead, but for my own survival. The worst part was the growing realization that we had been lied to about everything. American guards, despite their victory, sometimes showed us unexpected kindness. They shared their rations when they thought no one was looking. They called for doctors when we were sick. These were supposed to be demons, but they acted more human than many of my own countrymen had during the war. This confusion only deepened my despair. If the Americans were not monsters, then what did that make us? If our cause had not been righteous, then what did that make our sacrifices? The shame was overwhelming. I had not died with honor as my ancestors demanded. Instead, I lived in disgrace, a prisoner who ate the food of my enemies and spoke their language to survive. Every morning I woke up wishing I hadn't. Sleep was my only escape from the crushing weight of guilt, regret, and purposelessness that pressed down on me like stones. I began to understand why some of my fellow prisoners found ways to end their suffering permanently. Death seemed like mercy compared to this daily existence of shame and emptiness. February 14th, 1948 started like every other miserable day in that godforsaken camp. The mountain air was so cold it burned my lungs with each breath, and frost covered the inside of our barracks, windows like cruel artwork. I had been assigned to work in the laundry facility, one of the few heated buildings in the compound, though the warmth came at a terrible price. The work was backbreaking, standing over massive vats of boiling water for 12 hours at a time, washing the uniforms of our captors. My hands were already raw and blistered from months of this labor. The lye soap we used ate away at our skin, leaving permanent scars that reminded us daily of our servitude. But I welcomed the pain. Physical suffering was easier to bear than the constant ache in my soul, the weight of shame that pressed down on me every waking moment. At least when my hands bled, I could focus on something other than the emptiness where my purpose used to live. That morning I was weaker than usual. We had been on reduced rations for 3 weeks due to a supply shortage, and my body was running on nothing but stubborn will. The other women in my work detail moved like ghosts, their eyes hollow and distant. We had all stopped talking months ago. What was there to say? We were living reminders of a failed nation, breathing symbols of defeat and dishonor. The accident happened during the lunch break. I was carrying a large pot of boiling water from the washing station to the drainage area outside. The pot was heavy, maybe 40 pounds of scalding water and metal, and my malnourished arms trembled under its weight. But I had carried it 100 times before. I knew the route by heart, knew every step, every potential hazard. What I didn't know was that the maintenance crew had mopped the concrete steps with some kind of industrial cleaner that morning. When the mountain air hit the wet surface, it had frozen into a thin, invisible sheet of ice. My cloth shoes, already worn through at the soles, had no grip whatsoever. I remember the exact moment my foot hit that ice. Time seemed to slow down, the way they say it does in moments of crisis. I felt my left foot slide forward while my right foot stayed planted, sending me off balance. The heavy pot in my arms became a weapon against myself, its momentum pulling me forward toward the unforgiving concrete steps below. I remember thinking as I fell, finally, this suffering will end. There was almost relief in that moment of weightlessness, a strange peace in knowing that the daily torment of waking up in this place was about to be over. I had failed to die with honor in battle, failed to take my own life when capture became inevitable, but perhaps this accident would grant me the mercy I had been too cowardly to seek. The impact was devastating. My head struck the concrete steps first, and I heard the sickening crack of bone against stone. The boiling water exploded across my chest and arms as the pot ruptured, sending steam and scalding liquid everywhere. The metal rim of the pot caught me across the throat as I tumbled down the remaining steps, crushing my windpipe and sending stars shooting across my vision. But the pain, oh, the pain was beyond anything I had ever experienced. The boiling water seared through my thin prison uniform and burned deep into my flesh. I could smell my own skin cooking, could hear the terrible hissing sound as the water continued to scald me. My lungs filled with steam, and each breath became a struggle against fire itself. Fellow prisoners came running from all directions, their voices rising in panic. Even some of the American guards rushed toward me, their training overriding whatever prejudice they might have held, but I was already beyond their reach, slipping into a darkness that felt warm and welcoming compared to the agony racking my broken body. The camp medics arrived within minutes, but I could see the hopelessness in their faces even as consciousness faded. They worked frantically, cutting away my burned clothing, trying to assess the damage while attempting to stabilize my vital signs. One of them, a young soldier who couldn't have been older than 20, kept saying, stay with us," but his voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. They loaded me onto a makeshift stretcher and rushed me to the camp infirmary, a converted barracks building with basic medical supplies. The doctor, a gray-haired man named Captain Morrison, whom I had seen around the camp, took one look at me and began barking orders to his assistants. But I could read the defeat in his eyes. He had seen enough trauma during the war to recognize when someone was beyond saving. The burns covered nearly 60% of my body. My skull was fractured in 3 places from the impact with the concrete. Internal bleeding from the fall was filling my abdomen with blood faster than they could replace it with their limited supply. My breathing was labored and irregular, each breath a monumental effort that brought diminishing returns. Look inside your own heart right now and imagine watching medical professionals fight for your life while knowing they are losing the battle. I existed in a strange space between consciousness and oblivion, aware enough to understand what was happening but detached enough to observe it with an odd sense of calm. The doctor worked for 23 minutes trying to save me. 23 minutes of chest compressions, artificial respiration, injections of what little medicine they had available. 23 minutes of a dedicated medical professional refusing to give up on the life of someone who had been his enemy just years before. At 2:17 p.m., my heart stopped beating for the final time. Captain Morrison placed his stethoscope against my chest, listened for several long moments, then slowly straightened up and shook his head. "We've lost her," he said quietly to his assistant, pulling a sheet over my face. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. The pain vanished completely, replaced by a lightness I had never experienced. I found myself floating above the examination table, looking down at my own lifeless body with a detachment that should have been disturbing but felt perfectly natural. I watched the medical team clean up their equipment with practiced efficiency. I observed the gentle way they arranged my body, the respectful silence that fell over the room, and slowly I became aware that I was moving away from the scene, drawn by something I couldn't yet understand, toward a destination I couldn't yet imagine. The sensation of leaving my body was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my 23 years of life. One moment I was watching Captain Morrison pull the sheet over my face, and the next I was being drawn away from that cold infirmary room by an invisible force that felt both gentle and irresistible. It was as if I had been released from a prison I never knew I was in, freed from the weight of flesh and bone that had carried me through so much pain and suffering. I found myself moving through what I can only describe as a tunnel, though that word fails to capture the reality of what I experienced. It was not dark in the way we understand darkness on earth. Instead, it was a rich, warm absence of light that somehow felt more real than any brightness I had ever known. The walls of this passage seemed to pulse with life, and I understood somehow that I was traveling through the very fabric of existence itself. As I moved forward or upward, or in whatever direction transcends our earthly understanding of space, I became aware of a light ahead of me, but calling it light is like calling the ocean a puddle. This radiance was alive, breathing, filled with intelligence and purpose, and something else that took me completely by surprise. It was filled with love so pure and overwhelming that my entire being trembled in its presence. The light wasn't just bright, it was alive, pulsing with love I'd never experienced. Every particle of my consciousness was bathed in an acceptance so complete that it dissolved every fear, every shame, every moment of hatred I had carried like stones in my heart. This was not the conditional love I had known on earth, the love that depended on honor or achievement or proper behavior. This was love in its purest form, love that existed simply because I existed. As I drew closer to this incredible radiance, I began to sense a presence within it, not seeing in the way our physical eyes see, but knowing with a certainty that penetrated every fiber of my being. Someone was there, someone who knew me completely, who had watched every moment of my life with infinite compassion and understanding. And slowly, impossibly, I began to recognize who it was. The shock nearly sent me reeling back into the darkness. This was Jesus Christ, the same Jesus whose followers I had been taught to despise, whose cross had been shown to me as a symbol of Western weakness and spiritual corruption. How could the enemy's God be showing me such tenderness? How could the deity I had rejected and mocked be welcoming me with such overwhelming love? Every wall I'd built around my heart crumbled in his presence. The nationalism that had defined my identity, the racial pride that had shaped my worldview, the religious traditions that had formed my understanding of the divine, all of it dissolved like mist before the sun. In that moment, I understood that love transcends every human category, every earthly division, every barrier we create to separate ourselves from one another. He spoke to me without words, communicated with me in a way that bypassed language entirely and went straight to my soul. Not through my ears, but through my very essence, I heard him say that he had been with me through everything, through every moment of hatred I had harbored, through every act of cruelty I had witnessed or participated in, through every dark night of despair in that prison camp. He had been there, loving me, waiting for this moment when I could finally receive his love. The environment around us was beyond description, though I must try to share what cannot be shared. Colors existed there that have no names in any human language, hues that seem to sing with their own music and dance with their own rhythm. The very air, if it could be called air, thrummed with life and joy and peace that made every earthly pleasure seem like a shadow of the real thing. Music filled this place, though again calling it music is inadequate. It was the sound of pure emotion made audible, the harmony of perfect love expressing itself in frequencies that resonated through my entire being. Each note carried meaning, carried truth, carried healing for wounds I didn't even know I had. I understood that this was the music of creation itself, the song that had been playing since before time began. Ask yourself this question: what would perfect love feel like? Imagine the deepest acceptance you have ever experienced and multiply it by infinity. Picture the most profound peace you have ever known and understand that it was only the faintest echo of what surrounded me in that place. Consider the greatest joy that has ever filled your heart and realize it was merely a drop compared to the ocean of bliss that flowed through every moment of this encounter. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was seeing the wounds in his hands and feet, the mark of the crown of thorns on his brow. This was indeed the crucified Christ, the one whose death I had been taught represented weakness and defeat. Yet here he stood in magnificent glory, his scars not hidden but transformed into marks of ultimate triumph. His suffering had not been weakness but the greatest strength imaginable, love so powerful it chose to endure torture and death rather than abandon those he loved. I began to understand that his crucifixion had been for me, personally and specifically. Not just for humanity in general, but for Keiko Tanaka, the bitter Japanese woman who had spent years nurturing hatred in her heart. He had died for the prisoner of war, who had cursed his name, who had rejected his love, who had seen his followers as enemies to be defeated. The magnitude of such love was beyond comprehension. In his presence, time had no meaning. We might have been together for moments or for centuries. All I knew was that I never wanted to leave this place, never wanted to return to a world where such perfect love was not the air I breathed and the ground beneath my feet. This was home in a way that no earthly location had ever been. This was where I belonged, where I had always belonged, though I had spent my entire life as an exile who didn't even know she was lost. The landscape around us shifted and flowed like a living painting, mountains and valleys and streams that were more beautiful than anything earth could offer, yet somehow familiar, as if I was seeing the original templates from which all earthly beauty had been copied. Flowers bloomed with fragrances that carried memories of perfect moments. Trees bore fruit that satisfied hungers I didn't know existed, and rivers flowed with waters that quenched spiritual thirst I had carried my entire life. Then, without warning, my entire life began to unfold before me like an enormous tapestry being unrolled across the fabric of eternity. But this was not simply watching memories like scenes from a movie. I was experiencing every moment of my existence from multiple perspectives simultaneously, seeing not just what I had done, but understanding the full impact of every choice, every word, every thought I had ever entertained. The panoramic life review began with my earliest childhood memories, but I was not just reliving them as little Keiko. I was experiencing them as my parents felt them, as my grandmother experienced them, as the servants in our household were affected by them. Every tantrum I threw as a child, I now felt from my mother's perspective, understanding her patience and love in ways that brought tears to my spiritual eyes. Every act of kindness shown to me, I experienced from the giver's point of view, feeling their joy in blessing a child. But as the review progressed through my life, the experiences became increasingly painful. I lived through every act of hatred I'd harbored, every cruel word I'd spoken, every moment when I had chosen prejudice over love. When I was 12 years old, I had spit on a Christian missionary who tried to give me a piece of candy. Now I experienced that moment from his perspective, feeling his genuine desire to show Christ's love to a child, and the sadness that filled his heart when I rejected his kindness with such venom. The war years were almost unbearable to relive. I experienced the propaganda meetings where we were taught to hate Americans, but now I could see the spiritual realm overlaying those events. I watched as demons of hatred and nationalism fed on our anger, growing stronger with each racist chant, each pledge to destroy our enemies. I saw how my heart had been systematically hardened against God's love through years of carefully cultivated animosity. When the review reached my time as a military translator, I nearly begged for it to stop. I was forced to experience every moment when I had participated in the dehumanization of American prisoners. There was the day I translated during the interrogation of a young American pilot who had been shot down over Tokyo. The Japanese officers had beaten him mercilessly, and I had translated their questions with cold efficiency, feeling satisfaction when he cried out in pain. Now I experienced that interrogation from the pilot's perspective. His name was David, and he was 19 years old, just a farm boy from Iowa who had joined the Air Force to serve his country. As the blows fell on his broken body, he was thinking about his mother's apple pie and wondering if he would ever see his girlfriend Mary again. The most shocking revelation was that he had been there through all of it, loving me even in my darkest moments. I lived through every moment of participating in anti-American propaganda, seeing the spiritual poison I had helped spread through my translations and my enthusiastic support of the war effort. I watched myself giving speeches to groups of young Japanese women, urging them to view Americans as demons who would defile our sacred homeland. Each word of hatred I spoke sent ripples of darkness through the spiritual realm, contributing to an atmosphere of evil that fed the very powers of hell itself. But the most devastating part of the review was seeing how my hatred had affected innocent people. There was a Christian Japanese family in our neighborhood who had quietly maintained their faith despite persecution. I had reported them to the authorities, leading to their arrest and eventual death in prison. Now I experienced their final moments, feeling their forgiveness toward me even as they suffered the consequences of my betrayal. They had prayed for me with their dying breaths, asking God to save my soul despite what I had done to them. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself if you have ever been so consumed with hatred that you lost sight of other people's humanity. The review showed me that my prejudice had not just hurt my enemies, it had destroyed my own capacity for love. Every act of hatred had created another barrier between my soul and God's love, until I was living in a self-made prison of bitterness and rage. Yet through all of this painful revelation, Jesus remained beside me, his presence a constant reminder that I was loved despite everything I was seeing about myself. When the review reached the moments of my greatest cruelty, his love seemed to intensify rather than diminish. I began to understand that he had experienced every bit of suffering I had caused or contributed to, that he had carried the pain of every person I had hurt. The review showed me scenes I had forgotten, moments when his spirit had tried to reach me through the darkness. There was the American guard who had shared his chocolate with me when I was sick, despite my obvious hatred toward him. I now understood that Jesus had been working through that young man's kindness, trying to break through my hardened heart with just a small act of love. There was the fellow prisoner who had tried to tell me about God's forgiveness, and I had mocked her until she stopped speaking to me entirely. I saw the ripple effects of every choice, how my hatred had influenced other prisoners to harden their own hearts, how my bitterness had poisoned the atmosphere in our barracks. But I also saw the few times when I had shown small kindnesses, and how those moments had created ripples of light that blessed people in ways I never knew. The time I shared my meager ration with a sick woman, the moment I helped an elderly prisoner wash her hair, these small acts had been seeds of love that grew in ways I could never have imagined. The most overwhelming realization was understanding that Jesus had been present in every moment, loving all of us, Americans and Japanese alike, weeping over the hatred that kept us separated from him and from each other. War from God's perspective was not about right and wrong nations, but about his beloved children destroying each other while he watched in agony, unable to force them to choose love over hatred. As the review continued, I began to understand the cosmic significance of every choice for love or hatred. Each decision we make sends ripples through the spiritual realm that affect not just ourselves and those immediately around us, but generations of people we will never meet. My hatred had fed the very forces of darkness that sought to separate all humanity from God's love. Finally, the review reached the moment of my death in that prison camp, and I experienced it from Jesus' perspective. I felt his joy at finally being able to receive me into his presence, his excitement at the opportunity to show me the love I had rejected my entire life. The accident that had seemed so meaningless, so tragic, had actually been the doorway to the greatest blessing imaginable. As the life review came to its conclusion, Jesus turned to me with eyes that held all the love in the universe, and I knew he was about to offer me a choice that would determine my eternal destiny. His voice when it came was like gentle thunder, carrying authority and tenderness in equal measure. He told me that I could stay in this place of perfect peace and love, that my suffering was over and I could enter into the fullness of heaven where no tears would ever fall again. The temptation to accept immediately was overwhelming. After 23 years of struggle, hatred, war, and the crushing despair of imprisonment, the prospect of eternal rest in His presence seemed like the answer to every prayer I had never known how to pray. This was home. This was where I belonged, and every fiber of my being longed to remain forever in the warmth of His perfect love. But then He showed me something else. In what seemed like a vision within the vision, I saw the prison camp I had left behind. I watched the other Japanese women in my barracks, their faces etched with the same hopelessness that had consumed me for so long. I saw the American guards, young men who were following orders but carrying their own burden of guilt and confusion about the war. I witnessed the daily cycle of hatred and mistrust that poisoned the atmosphere of that place, keeping everyone trapped in cycles of bitterness that served no one. He asked me to return and share that His love knows no borders. The mission He was offering was not an easy one. I would go back to a world that would reject this message, return to people who would think I had lost my mind, carry a testimony that would challenge everything both sides believed about each other. But I would also carry the most powerful force in the universe, the same love that had transformed my own heart in His presence. The choice was mine to make, and Jesus made it clear that either decision would be acceptable to Him. If I stayed, I would spend eternity in perfect bliss, worshiping and serving Him in ways that would bring constant joy. If I returned, I would face persecution, rejection, and the daily struggle of living in a fallen world while carrying the memory of perfect love. Both paths led to Him ultimately, but one involved years of difficult service, while the other offered immediate reward. I thought about my fellow prisoners, women like Michiko, who cried herself to sleep every night, mourning children she would never see again. I remembered Yuki, who had stopped eating and was slowly wasting away from despair. I considered the young American guards who tried to maintain their humanity while doing their duty, boys like Private Johnson who sometimes slipped us extra food when the sergeants were not looking. As I wrestled with this decision, Jesus showed me glimpses of what my return could accomplish. I saw myself sharing this testimony, first with the other prisoners, then with the guards, eventually with people on both sides of the Pacific. I watched as hearts that had been hardened by war began to soften under the influence of divine love. I witnessed reconciliation between former enemies, marriages that crossed racial lines, children who would grow up free from the hatred that had poisoned my generation. But He also showed me the cost. I saw myself facing rejection from my own family when I returned to Japan as a Christian. I watched as former prisoners accused me of collaborating with the Americans, of betraying our culture and traditions. I witnessed years of loneliness as I stood between two worlds, fully accepted by neither, carrying a message that challenged both to embrace a love that transcended their differences. The vision expanded to show me the broader impact of this choice. My testimony would become a bridge between East and West, helping to heal wounds that went far deeper than any single war. Children who might have grown up hating would instead learn to see former enemies as brothers and sisters. The ripple effects would continue for generations as the love I shared multiplied and spread far beyond anything I could imagine. So I'm asking you, just as someone who has seen the other side would, could you choose the harder path if you knew it would bring healing to others? Could you accept years of struggle and rejection if the alternative meant leaving people in darkness who might otherwise find the light? With tears of both joy and sorrow streaming down my spiritual face, I told Jesus that I would return. The moment I made that choice, His love seemed to intensify even further, and I understood that this decision had brought Him tremendous pleasure. Not because my sacrifice was necessary for His glory, but because choosing to serve others over my own comfort reflected His own heart perfectly. He began to prepare me for the return, explaining that I would carry His presence with me always, though it would be veiled by the limitations of earthly flesh. The perfect communication we enjoyed in heaven would be replaced by prayer, but He promised to hear and answer every cry of my heart. The constant awareness of His love would be dimmed, by the distractions of physical life, but it would never disappear entirely. Jesus warned me that the transition back to my body would be jarring and painful. The spiritual realm where we existed was far more real than the material world, and returning to flesh would feel like putting on a heavy, ill-fitting garment after experiencing perfect freedom. But he assured me that this discomfort would fade as I learned to see earthly life through heavenly eyes. He also prepared me for the skepticism I would face. Most people, he explained, were not ready to hear about divine love that transcended human categories. They would prefer a God who took sides in human conflicts, who blessed their hatred and condemned their enemies. My message of universal love would challenge comfortable prejudices and force people to confront the darkness in their own hearts. The return began gradually, with the beautiful landscape of heaven slowly fading around the edges of my vision. Jesus remained with me until the very last moment, his presence an anchor of strength as I felt myself being drawn back toward the cold infirmary where my body waited. His final words to me were a promise that this separation was only temporary, that we would be reunited when my earthly mission was complete. The journey back through the tunnel was the reverse of my earlier ascent, but now it felt like exile rather than homecoming. Each moment took me further from perfect love and closer to a world where such love was rare and precious. But I carried his presence within me like a flame that no earthly wind could extinguish. Re-entering my physical body was like being crushed by a tremendous weight after floating in perfect freedom. The same body, but I was completely different inside. Every cell seemed to cry out in protest as my spirit squeezed back into flesh that felt impossibly small and limited. The burns on my skin flared back to life with agonizing intensity, and my broken skull throbbed with pain that seemed small compared to the spiritual anguish of leaving heaven behind. But even as the physical pain overwhelmed my senses, something miraculous was happening in the infirmary. Captain Morrison, who had pronounced me dead 23 minutes earlier, was checking one more time for any signs of life when my heart suddenly started beating again. My lungs, which had been still and silent, drew in a deep, shuddering breath that sounded like a gasp of surprise. The young medic who had been cleaning up the equipment dropped his tray with a tremendous clatter, his eyes wide with shock. Captain Morrison grabbed his stethoscope and pressed it against my chest, listening intently as my heart settled into a strong, steady rhythm that defied every law of medicine he understood. "It's impossible," he kept saying. "She's been dead for 23 minutes. But the monitors were registering strong vital signs. My breathing was deep and regular, and though my burns were still severe, my body seemed to be responding to treatment in ways that made no medical sense. The first words I spoke when consciousness fully returned were not in Japanese, but in broken English directed at the stunned medical team surrounding my bed. "Jesus," I whispered through cracked and burned lips. "Jesus saved me." Captain Morrison nearly dropped his stethoscope, while the young medic crossed himself despite regulations against such displays of faith. Over the following days, as my body began an inexplicable recovery that defied every medical prediction, I could not contain what had happened to me. The other Japanese prisoners gathered around my bed with expressions of bewilderment and concern. Here was a woman they had known as one of the most bitter and hate-filled among them, someone who had spent months cursing our captors and plotting impossible revenge, now speaking constantly about Jesus Christ and divine love. Michiko, my closest friend in the camp, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "The head injury has damaged your mind," she said with genuine worry in her voice. "You are speaking the language of our enemies, praising their God. When you are stronger, this madness will pass." But I knew with absolute certainty that what I had experienced was more real than anything I had ever known, more real than the barracks we slept in, or the barbed wire that surrounded us. My formal acceptance of Jesus Christ as my personal Savior came 3 days after my return to life, when a visiting chaplain made his weekly rounds through the infirmary. Chaplain Williams was a gentleman in his 50s who had been trying unsuccessfully to reach the Japanese prisoners for months, meeting only with suspicious stares and hostile silence. When he approached my bed, expecting the same reception he had always received, I greeted him in English and asked if he would pray with me. The shock on his face was profound as I told him in my limited English vocabulary about my death and encounter with Jesus. He listened with growing amazement as I described details about Christ that no one had ever taught me, theological truths that I should not have understood, but somehow knew with perfect clarity. When I asked him to help me accept Jesus as my Savior, tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. That prayer changed everything. Every morning became a gift instead of a burden. Where I had once awakened with dread at facing another day of captivity and shame, I now opened my eyes with gratitude for the opportunity to serve the Lord who had shown me such incredible love. The physical environment of the camp had not changed, but my perspective had been transformed so completely that the same surroundings seemed touched with divine purpose. The other prisoners watched this transformation with a mixture of fascination and horror. Some began to listen when I shared my testimony during the long evening hours in our barracks. I would tell them about the life review, about seeing our hatred from God's perspective, about the love that transcended every human division. A few women, worn down by years of hopelessness, began to soften toward this message of universal love and forgiveness. Yuki was the first to convert. She had been slowly starving herself to death, unable to bear the shame of survival when so many had died honorably. But when I explained how Jesus valued each life as precious beyond measure, how he had a purpose for every person who drew breath, she began to eat again. Her conversion created ripples throughout our section of the camp, as other prisoners witnessed the change in someone they had watched fading away. Learning Christian principles, despite our cultural barriers, became a daily adventure. Chaplain Williams brought me a Japanese Bible that had belonged to a missionary family, and I devoured every word with an hunger I had never felt for food. Each parable, each teaching of Jesus resonated with truths I had experienced firsthand in his presence. The Sermon on the Mount was not just philosophy to me, but a description of the character I had encountered in that place of perfect love. Daily prayer became as natural as breathing. I would rise before dawn and spend the first hour of each day in conversation with the Lord, who had become more real to me than any earthly authority. I prayed for my fellow prisoners, for the American guards, for the families on both sides who had lost loved ones in the war. These prayers were not obligations but privileges, opportunities to participate in God's work of healing and reconciliation. The most challenging part of my new faith was seeking forgiveness from the American guards and medical staff. Pride, even converted pride, struggled against the humility required to approach those I had viewed as enemies and ask for their pardon. But the love of Christ compelled me forward, and one by one I sought out the guards I had cursed, the medical personnel I had treated with contempt, the officers I had seen as symbols of oppression. Private Johnson, the young man who had sometimes shared his rations with us, was the first to understand what I was attempting to communicate in my broken English. When I asked for his forgiveness for the hatred I had harbored, this boy from Kansas began to weep and told me there was nothing to forgive. He had seen the change in me, witnessed the transformation that made no sense according to anything he had been taught about human nature. Captain Morrison required more convincing. As a medical professional, he struggled to accept that my personality change could be the result of anything other than brain trauma from the accident. But as weeks passed and my recovery continued to defy medical explanation while my new demeanor remained consistent, he began to consider that something beyond his understanding had occurred. Look inside your own heart right now and ask yourself how you would react if someone you had been taught to hate suddenly approached you with genuine love and request for forgiveness. These American soldiers, many barely out of their teens, found themselves grappling with theological questions they had never considered. If God could transform their enemies into friends, what did that mean about the nature of the war they had fought? What did it say about the propaganda both sides had used to justify their hatred? Word of my conversion and the circumstances surrounding it began to spread beyond our immediate camp. Military chaplains from other facilities came to interview me, trying to understand what had happened and whether it represented some kind of security risk or propaganda opportunity. But they found only a woman whose love for Jesus Christ was so genuine and transformative that it challenged every assumption they held about the nature of their enemies. The conversion of several other Japanese prisoners followed my own testimony. Within 6 months of my near-death experience, a small but growing group of Japanese Christians was meeting regularly for prayer and Bible study in our barracks. We sang hymns in broken English, shared testimonies of God's love, and supported each other as we learned to live as followers of Jesus in an environment that had been designed to break our spirits. My release from the prison camp came in late 1949, after my testimony had created enough impact to reach the attention of military officials at the highest levels. The decision was made that my continued presence was creating more reconciliation than security concerns, and arrangements were made for my repatriation to Japan as part of a prisoner exchange program. The journey back to my devastated homeland was bittersweet. I was returning to a Japan that had been utterly transformed by defeat, occupation, and the slow process of rebuilding. But I was also bringing back something that nation desperately needed, a message of hope and reconciliation that could heal wounds the war had opened in millions of hearts. When I stepped off the ship in Yokohama Harbor, I was no longer the bitter young woman who had left Japan as a prisoner of war. I was a daughter of the living God, carrying a love that knew no boundaries, and a testimony that would challenge everything my countrymen believed about their former enemies. Home was no longer a place, but wherever I could share his love with others who needed to hear that forgiveness was possible, that hatred did not have to have the final word, and that Jesus Christ loved them just as completely as he had loved me. So I'm asking you, just as someone who has seen the other side would ask, what is God calling you to do with your second chance? Every day we wake up is an opportunity to choose love over hatred, forgiveness over bitterness, hope over despair. My death taught me how to truly live, and Jesus showed me that love really can conquer all hatred, even hatred born of war. Ask yourself this question: have you ever believed so deeply in something that you were willing to die for it? I thought I was willing to die for my emperor, for my nation, for my pride, but I discovered that the only thing truly worth dying for is love itself, the same love that Jesus demonstrated when he died for his enemies on a Roman cross. That love is available to you today, right now, no matter what hatred you may have harbored or what enemies you may have made. The same Jesus who met a bitter Japanese prisoner can meet you today. All you have to do is call his name.